welcome you early birds. We're going to spend a few seconds waiting for people to get seated, so to speak. And by the way, thank you, those of you who tried to get on last week when we had a big tech breakdown. And but this is the session that we would have, run last week. So we're glad you are here. I think we can get started now. I'm Robin Lewis, CEO of the Robin Report. And Ethan, here we are again. And by the way, more excited than ever to gain your brilliance. And I mean that. You and I've talked about that. You're one of the best. Your analyses of tons of data are always profound. And really, because you tell us what it all means and why does it matter. So for those of you who have not met Ethan, it's Ethan Chernovsky. He's the CMO of Placer.ai, and I think he's quite brilliant. So now, one little housekeeping thing, please put your Q&A, put your questions in the Q&A little thing at the bottom of the screen, so that at the end we can, honor some questions. So, Ethan, thanks for joining us once again, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Robin. So, I mean, as always, it's like a joy to be here, and thank you everyone for joining. Apologies again for technical issues last week. I'd say a quick intro into Placer to give you a sense of what kind of informs our perspective on the world. So we're a data platform, and we look at foot traffic data. What that means, very simply, people vote with their feet. We're showing you how they vote across the United States every single day. We do that by observing a panel of tens of millions of devices. Very critically, it is all de-identified aggregate data. So we are GDPR and CCPA compliant. We then analyze that data with machine learning and AI algorithms in order to make estimations of visits to retail locations across the country. And we show them in a wealth of different reports within our platform. So everything from cross-visitation, true trade areas, visit counts, competitive benchmarking, and a whole lot more. And then we are able to apply that to kind of give a sense of what's happening in the world of retail. And with that, Robin, I think we can dig in.
Terrific. Go ahead. I mean, what we learned from the kickoff to 2023, and how do we, kind of properly contextualize the performance?
So I think the early part of the year is important because it sets the stage for what we're going to see, but I think it also allows us to have this standard to start from, which is, look, visits are down in almost all categories. Now, obviously, there's exceptions, but they're down, and there's a couple of kind of caveats to the downness, right? So the first is we have this difficult comp to periods where things were actually much stronger. We also have kind of these wider economic headwinds, which are clearly impacting the way we shop and move around and the decisions that we make. But there's also been some really interesting changes, right, that are important to call out. So for example, things like party size. So we know during certain periods in the pandemic period, even the immediate post-pandemic period, there were these increases in group size. And we saw that through kind of looking at transaction data and other resources. And we're seeing that go back to normal, so to speak. So if you had 3 or 4 people accounting for a single, kind of as part of one group accounting for a single transaction, that's shifting. So not all of the declines are negative. Some of them are a natural normalization of patterns post-pandemic. Some of them are caused by this challenging economic environment. But even then, when we consider those factors, there's 2 things that are working in retail's favor. One is that the declines are relatively small. So when we think about kind of a handful of percentage points down year over year in an economic environment like this, with the other factors that we mentioned, it's actually not so bad, especially when we consider there's always a margin of error when we're talking about estimations and visits. The other piece is we have seen these things offset by consumer behavior. So we are looking at longer visit durations from shorter visits. We are looking at things that, and I think Dollar General and others have talked about this in their earnings calls, where there are behaviors that are offsetting these challenges, and they indicate something really powerful for retail that we'll dive into a little bit more later.
So, Very interesting what goes on out there. It seems like it's different all the time. But how significant, has the impact of economic headwinds like inflation been, and how is it impacting consumer behavior going forward?
So I think this is like a really important element, because I think sometimes we talk about retail as if nothing's changed and we don't necessarily provide the proper context. We look year over year and it's obviously super valuable, but it's not giving us the whole picture. And the way we tend to look at this is like, imagine if you are a quarterback in a football game and it's snowing, and I'm comparing you to a game you played the year prior in a dome where there was no weather impacting you. It's just not the same thing. And therefore, the behaviors are going to be different. The accomplishments are going to be different. And all of that context is critical. So we think about the impact that these economic headwinds have had, and it's things like mission-driven shopping. So people making fewer visits, but looking to accomplish more with those visits. And we've seen that at superstores and grocery and other segments. We're looking at shorter journeys. So if you look at shopping centers that are in closer proximity to their audience, they tend to do better when you have equivalent ones than ones where they are further away from their audience. So there's this, even in some cases, irrational element of like, if I need to drive farther, I'm accruing more cost to that trip than maybe it actually deserves. And I think this is a really important element, because obviously the economic challenges have a major effect, and they have a major effect on specific audiences even more. But there is a psychological component to them as well. So this is front page news. We talk about kind of the R word of recession a lot. And that impacts the way consumers behave and the way they think about costs and when they decide to make purchases, maybe the purchase they decide to put off. So there are the rational factors, and there are the less rational, more psychological, behavioral impacts that are happening alongside. But then you have other things like, home prices and the stock market and trading down concepts. So the impact on consumer behavior has been really significant. I think the really interesting question is, how much of it is going to last even as things begin to normalize and hopefully these effects begin to dissipate?
Yeah. So, I like your point about, getting closer to the consumer. And that's, I've been ranting about that forever. Anyway, so Ethan, not all retailers, have felt the negative impacts. So what can we learn from the retailers that did see strong performances, to kick off the year?
So I think there's like a range of factors that are going to impact retailers. And some of them are factors that they control, and some of them are factors that they have less control over. So, think about your positioning if you are off-price retail or discount and dollar or a value-oriented grocery chain, obviously well-positioned within the wider economic trend. But I think there are other elements that benefit. So for example, this concept of like affordable luxury. So when we look at someone like Ulta or Starbucks or other coffee chains, we don't see necessarily the same declines we might expect because, okay, it's not the lavish spend, but it's something I can afford and it makes me feel better in this difficult period. I think if you look at segments that have classically done well during periods of economic challenges, one that pops up very often is movie theaters, because again, it's this, okay, it's not the greatest day out maybe, but it's one that I can afford and it lets me get out of the house and I can justify it. So this affordable luxury concept is really significant. I also think there's a question of where does the shopping experience play a significant role? So let's use Ulta again here. If you're going to buy makeup, if you're going to buy new creams or face or lotions or whatever it may be, the ability to go in, touch and feel, try the product, smell it, engage with it, talk to someone, where the shopping experience is part of the purchase and it improves the purchasing process, it's going to have value, and you're going to see, especially from a visit perspective, see that improve. And then I think there's also this idea of, again, products that are well positioned. So we have more virtual work. We want more comfortable clothes. I might wear my button down shirt, but I'm wearing my Lululemon pants underneath. That's always going to have this, it's this newer continued demand, especially with products that need to be replaced over time. And then finally, I think there's this ongoing question, and we love it when we talk about the fitness segment, for example, is this understanding of why do people make visits and what are they looking for when they make visits? So it's not enough to say like, I have a box and therefore people are going to visit it. It's asking what drives the visit. So is there a social component? Is there a value to the retail experience in a store that you can't get online? Is there an incentive to go there? Is there a reason? And I think the retailers and the segments that have presented that reason or are well positioned from a what is the consumer thinking and here's how kind of the stars have aligned, those are the ones that are going to see it, have seen a boost and will likely continue to see in the coming months.
Yeah. Bed Bath & Beyond's liquidation, Ethan, is clearly one of the bigger retail stories of 2023. So, what can we learn from the long road to failure that Bed Bath & Beyond experienced?
This one hit me hard because I was so, I don't know, maybe overly optimistic. I think obviously overly optimistic. There was in my mind, a real opportunity for a turnaround here.
Yeah.
And I think the capital financial situation was clearly challenging, but this was a retailer with tremendous brand awareness, tremendous reach in a period where home furnishings and home improvement were seeing a boost. It seemed like they had made the right executive decisions. This kind of, hey, we feel like Target's a good model for us. How do we move in that direction? And it clearly just didn't work or didn't work fast enough. And I think there are lessons that at least I undervalued. So for example, colleagues, Steve Dennis talks about kind of the unremarkable middle. I think kind of if you are everything for everyone, you probably lack an identity. And I think this is one of those cases where, why do I go to Bed Bath & Beyond instead of competitor? And if I don't really know, even if it's cheaper, it's more efficient, I understand why I'm making that visit, there's going to be a problem. I also think this kind of living in the nice to have or waiting too long to make the types of decisions that can help improve a future opportunity is a big lesson. There is no time to, it's interesting because in retail, you can't be rash. Like you don't want to jump into every new trend that people are saying is the next big thing. And we are going to talk about that as well. But you also can't not live in what we call the nice to have, which is not the things that are absolutely necessary to succeed today, but what's going to be that technology or that shift or that focus 3 to 5 years from now. And I think the longer you wait to move into that zone, we're learning that it is harder and harder to recover. And if you run into a situation like a pandemic, like the economic environment that followed it, it's just too much to overcome.
Yeah. Speed, technology is just outpacing us. I mean, how can we keep up with this anyway? Very good points here. Also, store visits and sales obviously have fluctuated a lot in recent years, and consumer behavior has really changed alongside. So, Ethan, how has it shifted? How has it shifted, and what does it mean for retail, going forward?
I think this may be for those who are bullish about not just the role of brick and mortar retail, but the evolution of the role of brick and mortar retail, that we haven't seen its high point. We're seeing kind of its next phases of development or the potential for that. I think mission-driven shopping might be the greatest signal of that power. And I'll explain what I mean. So mission-driven shopping, again, like we mentioned, is people making fewer visits, but spending longer times at the stores. So I don't want to go out as much for whether it's the cost of travel. It was during the pandemic. I don't want to, put myself in danger. Therefore, or, at risk of COVID, I'm going to make fewer visits, but I'm going to spend more time when I make those visits. The interesting thing is that didn't happen just once. So in the pandemic, we have, let's say, version 1, right? We're worried about COVID, so we're making fewer visits, but we're spending longer periods. Then version 2 is with all these new variants. But then we saw a version 3 when gas prices got high. So last year, as gas prices rose, we saw this behavior kind of re-emerge, and people making fewer visits, but spending longer periods of time when they make those visits. So more substantial visits, very often correlating with larger basket sizes. And I think this idea that consumers are willing to adapt to enable them to shop in stores is really important, because it tells us that there is something worthwhile to them about the in-store visit. So if you think like where we were pre-pandemic, this idea was, and imagine, let's take Burlington as an example. Burlington got rid of their e-commerce site, and we were all up in arms. And if you read news articles at the time, it was goodbye Burlington, because they don't have an e-commerce site. And then the pandemic hit, and they were like, oh, look, see, you don't have an e-commerce site, you're done, you're dead in the water. And then Burlington has this tremendous comeback, and they're doing incredibly well, and everything looks rosy. Because people wanted to go to Burlington, because there's something about that shopping experience that's valuable to them, that's worth it. And it's not going to be replaced by e-commerce. Maybe it can be improved or helped or supported by, but it's not a risk or a threat. And I think when we think about retail in general, there was this potential for brick and mortar to be pushed out. But instead, we see consumers consistently willing to shift their behavior in order to make brick and mortar part of their routine. And it's not because it's more convenient or it's easier. Online is easier. It's because in many cases, for the consumer, it's better. And I think that is a really important element here. And it asks retailers, how do they lean into that? How do I make, if better is the key, if the fact that there's something about going to these locations that is more effective for me as the consumer, how do I lean into that trend to emphasize and double down on those strengths and opportunities and not take away from them? And this is a big, I think, a really important element to keep in mind when we're having these innovation conversations. And I'll quote a colleague, Andy Murray, who was the ex-SVP marketing at Walmart, said this. It's like, we talk about in-store experiences and using digital screens. Like, how do we get people to use a QR code? And his point, and I think it's really smart, is don't use a QR code. Get people away from their phones. They're in the physical environment in order to have an experience. And even as much as we don't think about grocery shopping as like an experience, I mean, it's not a trip to the Maldives and it's not skiing with your family, but it is an experience. And you want people to be a part of that and get to enjoy or be a part of that to its fullest for them. Don't dissuade them. Don't take them out of that. I think that's a really important element for us to understand, that if we want to maximize physical channels, we need to embrace the benefits that they bring the same way we would have to do for digital channels.
Yeah, Ethan, it's really amazing, this idea of experience, the word experience. I mean, my God, I remember back in the early 80s when I was with VF Corporation, it's all we talked about was the consumer experience. That's what you had to provide. Well, here, what, a half a century later, we're still talking about it. So it's unbelievable. So, Ethan, what defines experience in retail, and how should leading players address experience in the brick and mortar atmosphere? So
I love this question. This is like a big debate that I have been having with kind of this. I think it starts with, I think we often think of experience within the framework of experiential, right? So we think of, I don't mean this in a negative term, but things are a little bit more, gimmicky. So a little bit, oh, it's a climbing wall and it's this extra. But I think one of the things you increasingly come to terms with is that experience is baked into the retail process, especially for the ideal retailers. So again, we mentioned it with Ulta and makeup and Sephora and MAC and all of them in that category. Think about a Buff City soap where people come in and they get to experience a Bath and Body Works, smelling the candles, engaging with the products. But experience can also be baked into the service you provide. So think, Chanel has these, appointment only store. Best Buy used appointments at different stages. So the experience can be, the coming in and having a personalized engagement. It can be like Apple. It can be, or again, Best Buy coming in for service and help to use products better, to engage. The question is, what is the experience for? And I think that's what retailers need to ask. Like, why is someone coming to a physical location, and how do I lean into that to make it as attractive as possible? So in some cases, it's the products that do it for me, so like makeup. In other cases, it's the discovery experience. If I'm Target or Walmart and I have this massive box with so many things going on, people are going because they're saying, I need to get this, but maybe I'll also get that too. So it's convenience and discovery kind of intertwined. In other places, it's, grocery. It could be fresh products. I want to touch and feel my cucumbers before I buy them. But actually working to understand, why is it that they're coming to the store? What does experience mean within that setting? And then how do I optimize for that? And again, it's a sillier example that we use quite a bit, but I think it's a good one. When you walk into a Rolex store, they're wearing a suit and they lay out the mat and they put out the watch and they treat you like you're a person who is worthy of buying a Rolex watch, and they value their product and they treat it with care, and that gives you a feeling of excitement as well. That same experience would not work for a myriad of other products, but it works really well for Rolex. And I think the more retailers ask, why are we doing this? Who is this for? Why are we providing this experience? I think it helps uncover why some things work that don't necessarily make immediate sense to us, and why other concepts don't work where we were like, oh my God, this is an absolute nail on the head, because it doesn't fit within that environment for those products for that audience. And I think the difference between experience and experiential, the recognition that experience is not one size fits all, that it means so many different things, is a really important part of understanding how it's going to continue evolving.
Yeah, I would throw in Lululemon as highly experiential, wouldn't you? So, it's the same thing you're talking about, basically. So, Ethan, when we look at the, the larger behavioral changes, like migration pattern shifts and virtual work, how should we understand their potential long-term impact? I think it's got to be a major thing.
I agree with you. And I think the big thing is that when you dive into these patterns, you're trying to understand, there was one of the things that happened early on when we saw this quote unquote, and again, this narrative was exaggerated, but I think the kind of headline resonates: exodus from the cities. There were many who were saying, okay, this is short term, people are going, they're going to the space, they'll come right back. And that didn't quite happen. And I think a large part of the reason that didn't happen is because these were not knee-jerk reactions. They were rational decisions. So we see in most cases, when we saw movement patterns, we saw significant shifts in migration patterns, whether it's an increase or a hastening up of, it was places from higher cost of living to lower cost of living, higher HHI to lower HHI, higher cost of housing to lower cost of housing. People were doing it so they could have more space, so they could buy instead of rent, and so they could live a better quality of life. That is a rational core decision to try something new. Now, that doesn't mean people didn't replace them in the cities, and there aren't audiences for whom the city experience is more valuable than the ones who are leaving. Like that is a very important counterpoint here. But it was rational. And even when we think about things like virtual work, it's not just, oh, I can now, and then you're going to force me back. A significant percentage of people are finding that this is better for them, that they want to maintain this pattern. And even if they come back to work a little bit, they're not going to come back to work all the time because it's a rational choice. So we looked at one of the things we'll see in terms of return to office. The return to office is much stronger in areas where there are a smaller proportion of people with households with children, right? If we apply other data sets on top of ours, we'll see that you're more likely, if you don't have kids, to go back to the office more than if you have kids. Again, a very rational process. I got to pick up my kids at 3:30. I want to see them a little bit more. I want to commute a little bit less. So what does all this mean for retail? It means that there is a lasting component to the shifts and opportunities that help us understand certain challenges that might not be as bad as they seem, and certain opportunities that might be even bigger than they seem. So think about challenges. Think about something like the pull forward of demand in home improvement. I think home improvement is an incredibly well-positioned sector, not just because they saw a boom, but because people move. When they move, it brings first-time demand to fill that house, to take on projects, and to, take advantage of the new furniture that you're going to need to fill these rooms with because you have a bigger space. I think it brings opportunities for grocery and wholesale clubs because all of a sudden the value of Costco is much more if I have a pantry to fill with the extra large, mustard that I bought. Those things aren't going to go away. And so if you believe that first-time demand still exists, even if home improvement sees a dip, at least I don't expect that to last, because I think that first-time demand concept will drive ongoing value over time. And it's also going to give kind of these opportunities that we have seen some extra legs. So we know that there's been more visits midday to grocery stores. We know that there's been more visits midday to coffee shops in the suburban areas. So we're working from home and we decide we need to get out of the house for a little bit. So we pop over to our local Starbucks or, Dutch Bros or whatever it may be. And we get a cup of coffee in the middle of the day. And that behavior is likely not going to go back to what it was because this change is going to sustain. And it's not everyone going back versus no one going back. It's small but significant shifts. And I think the recognition that these shifts are very rational, they make a lot of sense, and they're deepening within the audiences you'd expect them to deepen for, mean they have a lot of staying power.
Yeah. The shifts are just amazing what's going on. And I'm trying to absorb all the stuff you're saying here, Ethan. I think it's just terrific. So the leading players in home improvement, okay, and other segments went from experiencing all-time highs to struggling in a more difficult environment. Do you think, is there an end in sight? And how can these retailers cope with this?
So I think the end is in sight. I think we're seeing the visits, not just visits recover when we do a year-over-year comparison for leading players like Home Depot and Lowe's. We're seeing that the overall month-over-month, week-over-week trend is very positive for this sector. And I think what's interesting is we talk about mission-driven shopping and the impact that it's had. There's extra elements that has an impact here. So one of the biggest shifts we've seen in home improvement is far less cross-visitation between Home Depot and Lowe's. And it's meaning maybe it was that a year ago, if I want to get something, there's a big chunk of the audience that said, let's check out both. Or I'll get this there and this there. And right now I'm just consolidating those visits. So I'm only going to one. Also could be the sign of kind of the return of more of that stable factor where it's more professionals coming back and that core audience is taking up a bigger proportion of those core visits. But I think when we, again, like we mentioned before, when we think about the wider opportunity, I don't think that's changed. I think it's been a difficult economic environment. That difficult economic environment was especially hard for home improvement because that's a much simpler cost to push off if you can. I don't know that I need to redo my bathroom right now. I can wait a few months to do that. And therefore, this is a segment that was going to feel that pain a little bit more, especially considering the height that they had seen and the pull forward of demand. And that gives me a lot of confidence that we're going to see this segment rebound. Does that mean everything will be rosy for the next 6 months? No, not necessarily. But it does mean that we need to differentiate between short-term challenges and long-term challenges. And if we think sometimes there are bumps in the road in the short term, but that doesn't necessarily change the upward trajectory that I think some of these segments have. And this is a great example of one of them.
Yeah. To say we're operating in a difficult environment would be a huge understatement, right? So yet even in situations like these, there are opportunities, and at least, Ethan, there's some examples of brands leaning into these, and what are the wider lessons to be learned for all of us?
I think the wider lesson is just that. It's, yes, things are difficult, but you have to maximize your opportunity even within a difficult environment, because you can't throw your hands up. And so you try to be as creative as you can. And so, the example I always, I gave, we were at a conference recently, is you look at sports teams and how many of them have a really good player that gets injured at some point of the season or the playoffs, and they have to figure out how to creatively work around that gap. Would they love to have that player back? Of course. Is it ideal that they are not there? No, but they have to figure out how to move forward. And I think what you see when you look at the retail landscape is there are interesting elements that are short-term opportunities that could lead to longer-term strengths if for these brands that lean into them. So take the example we just gave of coffee in the suburbs. I have a coffee shop near my home that I like to go to. I tried it off in kind of when virtual work before our office reopened. I would go there, I'd get a cup of coffee, maybe a croissant if I was really rewarding myself. And I'd work there for an hour or two just to get out of the house, give myself a change of scenery. that behavior stuck. And now I go there a lot more than I would have before. I think grocery stores and fitness are similar with midday visits. If I am a gym goer and now I have this opportunity to go at 2 o'clock in the afternoon because I started work a little bit earlier, or I'll end a little bit later, I'll figure out how to leverage that flexibility. That might give me a better experience, which makes me more likely to come more, renew, take classes as well, whatever it may be. Or to go to the grocery store at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday instead of 6:30 Wednesday when I'm already on my way home from work and I'm stressed and I just rather go to the QSR restaurant and buy dinner for my family. And maybe I'm more list oriented, and maybe I'm more willing to consider discovery and what I would want to buy for the rest of that week. And so some of these behaviors offer an opportunity for retailers who can embrace them, incentivize them, lean into them. So how do I take that person who's coming at 10 a.m. and give them the better experience and make sure I have the staffing there and adapt to that my staffing to make sure I'm there to give that experience that's going to lead to the larger basket and the more consistent buying from the grocery store as opposed to the restaurant? How do I, as the coffee shop, make sure I'm ready to take advantage of that customer, have a deal in place to incentivize more of those visits, because I know it can become a behavior that extends far beyond what we're currently experiencing. So I think even in these difficult environments, it's obviously very challenging, and I don't think we should minimize that in the slightest. But even in challenging environments, there are opportunities. And I think you see retailers that lean into those opportunities and benefit from them long after.
So off price and discount and dollar stores and so forth have been two of the strongest segments in retail, even in 2023. Yet what we're seeing interesting are big shifts in those areas. So Ethan, what is driving the change and how should we understand it?
I think this is really exciting because you look at segments that are doing well and you see them doing things that are different or embracing elements that they don't always, not all this is new, like TJ Maxx Runway is nothing so new, but you see retailers who are trying things. So, think about Five Below going up market, Dollar General launching Pop Shelf, even though they said they're, recently they're going to slow down that expansion. These tests and concepts are really important because they allow retailers to find other levers to reach their audiences or to reach new audiences that are adjacent to theirs. So how do I if I'm Dollar General, I know that I have a model that works really well, that I have a really compelling message for my audience, then people are going to come to my location, they're going to come often. But is there a way for me to go slightly up market with a slightly more expensive concept that would reach an adjacent audience? And I think Pop Shelf as a test to see how to reach that is really exciting. When you think about, again, Nordstrom Rack is nothing new, but department stores leveraging off-price element, even Dick's leveraged an off-price element. Off-pricers figuring out other mechanisms of reaching their audience. These are powerful concepts because they show retailers that are operating from a strength and trying out new concepts to figure out their next levels of growth. I think it's a very good sign of a retail environment that is very focused on optimizing and evolving.
So Ethan, big picture, what are the key innovations that you're seeing for us to watch in retail, and why?
So I've been working in the technology innovation ecosystem for my entire career. And I think there is a lot of exciting, amazing concepts that come through, and we talk about them a lot, and they're really interesting and important. And we talked about the nice living in the nice to have, but it is very important to create a differentiation between what has an impact a decade from now, what will have an impact 2 to 3 years from now, and what is going to have an impact tomorrow. And I look at things like blockchain and driverless cars and generative AI and really exciting elements with, certainly they have use cases, but they are limited in the short term because these technologies aren't there yet. Doesn't mean they won't be. It doesn't mean they won't change things in the next 5 years, but it means today, these are not the elements that are going to change everything. The metaverse is a great example of that as well. So I think there is this thing we need to emphasize of make sense technologies that allow us to do our job better now. In the short term, how do we make BOPUS better? And I think the example is Target, right? Target says, not only can you get products, you want a coffee too? We'll bring that out to you as well, because we have a lot of Starbucks locations within our stores. I want to talk about, retail media and the ability to take advantage of the advertising value of my store, because you're already walking in. It's something I can turn on fairly immediately. By the way, especially, even though we don't think about this as new, we never leveraged retail media within physical environments the way we did its digital counterparts. And we know the challenges with those kind of search-based advertising. There's something really exciting going on. Frontline support. How do we help our workers in the stores have a better sense of what's going on, how to get the right products to the right people and give better service? I think the understanding of timing, like how do we optimize our staffing so that we're there when people are coming, so that we can give the right promotions at the right time, so we can incentivize the right behaviors. These are all things that could be done tomorrow and have a really nice impact. It doesn't mean negating the 5-year term or the 10-year term or even beyond. Those are all incredibly exciting and they require focus and demand attention. But sometimes the narrative that carries, and again, for me, the metaverse was the perfect example of it. Just a few months ago, it was everything is going to be in the metaverse. Look at every retailer who's doing something in metaverse. None of it's happening. And it doesn't mean it's not great for the future. It just means it's not here for now. And that balance, when we talk about innovation doesn't have to be a next decade thing. It can be a tomorrow impact. And embracing that opportunity, I think, is very significant for the retail environment.
Well, just a comment before we go into questions here. The metaverse thing, is incredible. But, a Bitcoin thing was similar. Everybody jumps on it and all of a sudden there's no there, right? Anyway, so here we are. But so we do have, I think, some questions. And Deborah, are you going to come and turn out some of those questions for us?
I am. So Ethan, that was incredibly comprehensive. So it doesn't leave a lot of space for questions, but there are a few. You often use Ulta as your benchmark example. How come you never use Sephora?
Sephora Ulta is an easier one for us to track in its full glory, just because it's less mall based. So we have traffic. There's just a larger margin of error for those locations. So Ulta's just works better within our system to have that level of kind of accuracy. But the same thing applies to Sephora. Every data point we've looked at for Sephora has been equally impressive. I think they're a tremendous retailer. I think again, I think we've spoken about this in the past. Even if you would have said 4 years ago, Kohl's and Sephora are going to have a partnership, I think our reaction probably would have been, oh, lucky Sephora. I think today we're saying, oh, lucky Kohl's, which is a tremendous testament to Sephora.
Got it. So here's something to build on your Target graph that we just saw. Have you tracked what's happened lately since this whole gay pride incident, maybe a continuing event, has happened?
We have very specifically not commented on it, and I'll explain why.
Them too.
Yeah, it's when something is extra politicized, and again, I just mean that there's an extra component there. We are extra careful with what the data shows, because it has the tendency to misuse the data is increased. What we have seen is that there is an ongoing continuation of trends that we had seen previously. Are there some places of declines? Absolutely. Are there some places of increases? Yes. And it's really difficult to discern what is just the normal continuation of trends we'd already seen and what is related to this specific issue. I will say that in most situations where we've seen political conversations around retail, so think Home Depot when they had a founder who was pro-Trump. I remember this when I was working in a digital intelligence company around the Cambridge Analytica scandal. The changes are usually very, very small, and it's difficult to discern what it is. And therefore, we're very careful only to comment when we think there is a high degree of confidence that these two things are related.
That seems logical. So do you think right now, based on, you guys were talking about the uncertain economy, do you think that we're experiencing in terms of consumer behavior, a kind of utilitarian approach to purchasing where it's more based on necessity rather than what's nice to have or want?
I think yes, as like a general statement. I think when you think about, again, shifts like trading down, elements like the pull forward of demand, some of the kinds we've seen for kind of clothing when compared to superstores or elsewhere, I think it's hard not to say there is a consolidation where I'm looking to spend on specific things or things that I need versus what I might ideally want. But I think that's to be expected in an environment like this. So I think I will say the declines in many cases are far less than we expected, especially when we consider the unique, how volatile the environment has been, how challenging it's been, the pure kind of obstacle course that retail has faced. And so I think the adapting consumer in this environment is a very significant element to call out.
So the flip side of that is that you showed that visits to luxury brands is low, but their earnings reports are off the charts. So how do you correlate store visits with their incredible financial success right now? I'm talking about the big guys.
Yeah, I think in some cases it's the right visitor versus visitors, right? So if we think about periods where visits are kind of, the faucet has been turned on and everyone's out and about, that visit gain doesn't always correlate perfectly with sales. If I have, especially within luxury, and I think that, the Chanel example is apt too. If I'm doing appointment shopping for a specific audience, I am looking to gain more out of every engagement than I would as like a store where everyone come in, get whatever you want. So I do think luxury is better situated for that. I do think it does depend on the case. There, obviously there are those who are doing better and those who are struggling a little bit more. I think there's a capacity to spend for specific audiences. And if you are aligned with those audiences, you're going to see it. I do think clearly visits have been impacted, but the visit correlations with transactions are not the same. And what's interesting is they're changing. So we see points where visits are above transactions, and we see points where visits are below transactions with those mission-driven shopping trends, the return to normal, group size being larger. So it's really important to have your finger on the pulse to understand what are those triggers, because if efficiency can be the key, it's important that you know that as a retailer. I need to maximize my visits. My in-store experience isn't as important, it's much more important, because every visit that comes in is a very important swing. I'm not going to get as many. Whereas if I'm in a situation where the visits are flowing, it's a slightly different orientation.
Okay, so here's a question that's a build on the luxury question. So in the luxury space, what's the most exciting tech that you're aware of or encountered to help CRM and customer loyalty?
So it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I really think the biggest thing in engaging customer loyalty, and this is less a Placer thing, this is more kind of just having spent time in the technology space, is how do we engage people contextually? So, let's take luxury clothing for an example. I think the best thing that retailers can do is get people to try things on in the store, figure out what their sizes are, figure out what things work for them so that they're likelier to buy again. I think when engagements are, especially in luxury, the ongoing engagements need to be more subtle and more refined and a little bit less aggressive. And you don't always see that. I think sometimes the CRM toolkit is a little bit too much blast, blast, blast. Hey, we have a sale. Now we have a sale. Now we have a sale. And that's not the methodology for luxury. And so it's so much of it is about the technology enablement, but a lot of it is also about when you have that technology, what is the right message to be delivering?
Totally fair. Here's another one. Do you believe that brick and mortar retail is currently taking share from online?
I think in some cases, yes. And I think in other cases, it's the reverse. I think most importantly, the overwhelming majority of retailers we talk to, of product companies we talk to, of everyone in between recognize that the distinction doesn't make sense anymore. That online and offline are not separate entities competing. They are channels for reaching audiences. And so let's take the example, we were just discussing. There are brands that are oriented towards people who have a very strong orientation towards convenience. And so if I can go in once, find the right size, I might never go into that store again, but purchase a ton. That doesn't negate the critical importance of that initial visit and getting people into that. You don't need many visits. You need a really great one visit that leads to the online sales. In some cases, the online experience brings people offline. And so it's, I think in every case, asking, what does digital do for me? What does physical do for me? And how do I leverage those both together? Even think about something as simple as grocery, right? So there's, we were at a conference where there was this amazing technology that allowed you to get certain products delivered automatically once a month. So I need paper towels every month. It's going to be on my doorstep the 15th of every month, and there I'm done. I don't need to worry about paper towels. I don't necessarily want that for bananas because I want to go pick them out. And maybe I have too many bananas. So there are, even within the same retailer, there might be different products that I want a different type of engagement with. And so it really comes down to every retailer asking, what does my customer want from me? How do I deliver that? Leveraging digital channels to utilize their advantages and physical channels to utilize their advantages.
Pragmatism.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Another question is, and you've talked about this before in our sessions, do you have any new restaurant trends that you guys have been tracking?
So this is really interesting. I think there's a lot of exciting things in restaurants. I think that one of the most interesting things happening in restaurants isn't happening in restaurants, it's happening in convenience stores. The amount we hear about food and high quality food being a bigger and bigger part of the convenience store puzzle is really interesting to me, because that is not what my expectation of convenience was. Like, my expectation of convenience store was a place where maybe I go in and get a Slurpee, a quick snack, and I'm on my way. This idea of having not just ready-made food, but high quality ready-made food is something that's really interesting. And I think it's driving a lot of the reason that convenience has been so innovative and seeing a really extended shift when you wouldn't expect it, because convenience you generally associate with commuting, right? When commuting is high, people are going to go by their convenience store, they're going to stop at the gas station, et cetera, et cetera. Those trends are down, yet convenience is doing really well. And I think it's because of leaning into food.
Well, I think there'll be even a bigger trend as all these convenience stores that are connected to gas stations become charging stations. And then they're going to have to expand their products and services so you have enough to do for 25 minutes for you're waiting for your car to charge.
Yep.
So that's a total area of opportunity. Okay, just a couple more. Do you see premium apparel like Tommy Bahama? That was a specific example. What do you see in their future in retail?
I think the interesting thing that's a challenge with premium apparel is one of the things we hear a lot about is the top tier malls and shopping centers that these folks want to be in are shrinking the amount of space they're dedicating to apparel and beauty. And so there's more competition for fewer spaces. The positive side is that for those landlords, because they have more optionality, they have the ability to kind of create their ideal mix. I think the potential opportunity for those retailers is asking, well, what other cards do they have to play? Do they want to check out certain outlet centers? Do they want to check out certain high streets or even suburban areas? Do they want to think more about pop-ups and other types of experiences? So I think there is a lot of value for premium apparel. I think the challenge is there's a lot of really good premium apparel players, and there's a lot of really interesting digitally natives who are coming offline, competing for the same spaces.
Thanks. Last two. I think a recent report, you guys said that foot traffic was way up in New York City. Not as high as it was, but certainly up. So the question is, how do you correlate visits to a downtown to the health of the city? Because, for example, in New York, there are miles and miles of empty storefronts. So are these tourists who are visiting, or?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't remember the exact report and the context of that report, but I do think it is the city recovery question is really complex and really interesting. So on the one hand, I mean, let's think about office visits. Visits are in New York City, I think, are down, 20 or 30%. Unique visitors are down less than that. which means that people are coming back. They're just not coming back as often. And what does that mean for the surrounding areas? So a question we very often kind of will pose when we're having this kind of discussion is, if I went to the office 5 days a week, how often did I go out for lunch pre-pandemic? Maybe 2 or 3 days, maybe more, but maybe 2 or 3 days on average, right? If I only go back to the office 2 or 3 days a week, how often am I going out for lunch? Is it the same? Is it still, because I'm going to have the social interactions, to engage with my colleagues? That's the purpose of that day. The day I work from home is to just, get through work. So how much of it is really changing and how much of it demands shifts? Now, obviously there are changes, but it's the magnitude of the shifts that's really a big question. Is it that it's the Monday, Friday, and therefore I want to double down on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? In certain areas of cities, for example, residential areas, we have retailers who are telling us they're doing better than they've ever done, right, because those areas are full. And so you're absolutely right in saying that the city is a complex, very large ecosystem, and viewing it as one holistic entity is overly simplistic.
Thank you. Last one. So why did you guys choose Buff City Soap as a kind of a bellwether? It's a fusion of a makerspace, sustainability, and wellness. And so is that a magic formula for the future of innovative retail? Are there other new retail models that you guys have been tracking?
I thought it was so cool. I think it's, I look at them, I don't know what, people who are making soaps and candles for whatever reason are triggering me to get excited. And it's, it stems for me from, I am not a lover of the mall visit. It's not my favorite thing to do on a weekend. And we will pack up in the car and go to the mall on the weekend, and it's me, my wife, and our 3 children. And how many times that mall experience has been saved by the fact that I could take my youngest into a Bath and Body Works and we could smell soaps for 30 minutes and candles. And which one do you like? Oh, what about this one? There is something about that experience that makes me fall in love with those brands. And I think obviously it's kind of an easier one because it's so obviously baked in, but there is an element of retailers asking, like, okay, well, why am I part of this? How do I fit into this mix? And I do think, whether it's discovery, trying things on, touch and feel, I don't think enough, especially kind of older retailers that are evolving and trying to kind of keep up with newer ones. Why am I going to your store? And if it's just to buy product, then you are at risk if online is more convenient, if online is better, why would I ever come to your store? If there's an element of experience in the store, whether it's trying things on, making sure I find the right thing, really helpful staff, it can be the basics. The basics can be really valuable. And I think we can't lose sight of that.
Well said. And if you live in Texas, you can take home your own soap that you made by yourself. Thank you very much. It was great. Marvelous presentation. Thank you.
Ethan, as usual, thank you so much. You're terrific. And we always like having you. So we'll look forward to the next time.
December.
Thanks, everyone. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
You too, Ethan.